Hello and welcome to our audio commentary. I'm Nick Redman, documentary filmmaker and record producer, and today I have the very great pleasure of sitting here with two wonderful writers, Julie Kirgo, who is perhaps one of the best film essayists around at the moment, and screenwriter Lem Dobbs, who will not allow me to say his credits out loud.
Google them.
Here we are watching a blank screen with the word overture on it, and I think perhaps this is where we should mention Frank Cordell, the composer of this, I think, rather great score. I know that he was up against some tremendous competition in the 60s. There were some really great scores being written around this time, and so this was something for him to really compete with. But I like this. There are a couple of very wonderful themes, and it's a long score. It's a big score, and it fits the film very well. You know, Cordell primarily was not a composer originally. He was an arranger, like a lot of guys who came up in that era. He was born around the end of World War I, worked for Forces Radio, I think, during the war.
Yes, and he probably is most famous, at least in this period, for also writing the score for Cromwell. He did a lot of British television and radio, BBC Radio in particular. And he was actually a fascinating character, quite apart from being a composer. He and his wife Magda ran a salon, a kind of bohemian salon in London. And then after his career as a composer sort of petered out, he retired to a sheep farm where in the English countryside, where apparently he welcomed all kinds of people from the music world, including the Beatles. And I often wonder if maybe Paul McCartney ended up with a sheep farm and cuddling lambs on the covers of his albums because of Frank Cordell.
I would love that to be true. For the sake of this commentary, we'll just pretend it's true.
It's a nice fantasy.
Of course, the other thing that Frank Cordell did in the mid-'60s, which I think a lot of people don't know much about, is that he actually wrote and recorded a score for Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, it was not a score of original music. It was a classical adaptation score, perhaps along the lines of what Leonard Rosenman did later for Barry Lyndon. But it was recorded, at least sections of it was recorded before, of course, Mr. Kubrick declined to proceed with it. And recently, the Frank Cordell estate has been going through and curating quite a lot of Cordell's work, and the tapes have come to light, as have the tapes to Khartoum, which is a blessing for us because as a result of their generosity, they have allowed us to use the composer's personal tapes of Khartoum, the mono mixdowns, for our isolated score as the original multi-track masters seem to have disappeared. And as the original LP that came out at the time of the film was a re-recording, we will have the very first presentation of the complete original score as it was written for the film.
It's fantastic.
Of course, he did have some very stiff competition this year. The scores that were nominated for Academy Awards in this year were Born Free, which won, Hawaii, Elmer Bernstein, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Alex North, and The Sand Pebbles, Jerry Goldsmith, and The Bible. So it's
that was quite a group.
Heady competition.
You know, our new Blu-ray of Khartoum has been culled from a transfer that is done from the 65mm element. So the picture is rather spectacular, in my opinion. The sound, though, is 2.0, which I know will cause a little bit of controversy because people will say, oh, well, it must have originally been done in 6-track. There's got to at least be a 4.0 somewhere. If there is one somewhere, we're not in a position to be able to locate it and put it on this Blu-ray. But the 2.0 is surprisingly vibrant, rather like old Laserdisc used to be, where the sound quality, at least in the stereo field and the dynamism of the sound, is actually a lot more present than it has later become for both DVD and Blu-ray.
Here we have this very star-studded cast. I just want to point out that this was, in fact, one of kind of the last of its breed, which is the roadshow picture. This would have been, I mean, obviously the fact, just the tip-off right away is that there is an overture, there is an intermission and an entr'acte and exit music. this probably would have been screened at theaters with hard tickets sold. There would have been ushers in the theater. It was a real experience to go to one of these roadshow movies.
And a program booklet, of course.
Oh,
You
of
get a
course.
rather elaborate magazine-style program, souvenir.
We used to love those. I mean, that was always a sign that you were seeing a big movie. And of course, this film was shot in a process called Ultra Panavision, but it was actually screened in Cinerama in some places and actually has the Cinerama logo on the poster. I always thought that a bit strange since it's obviously not shot in 3-panel Cinerama, but it is in fact very wide. I think the aspect ratio of this is about 2.76 to 1, something similar to what Ben-Hur would have been.
And in fact, it starts with what had already become a kind of a cliche of Cinerama presentations, which are those kind of sweeping, soaring, flying shots to make you think you're sort of in an airplane, really, because the screen would have been so big and curved in that way, particularly if you were sitting up front, that the idea was to envelop you in the experience, and you sort of forget about the theater you're sitting in completely.
Let's talk a little bit about the what some people describe as the travelogue opening, which was a bit of a trope at this period of filmmaking, wasn't it? Often you had to be introduced to the exotic lands that you were going to visit.
And this one, look, it's perfect. Here's the flying aerial shot, but it opens on the pyramids, the mysterious pyramids. And I do think that the word mysterious pops up 3 or 4 times in the narration, which, by the way, is by the beautiful, silken-voiced Leo Gann, who is an actor I love. He was the very comforting psychiatrist to Olivia de Havilland in The Snake Pit, but never mind. I kind of like that they are setting the stage here. What they don't do, interestingly, is really to set the stage historically, because if you want to understand Khartoum, you kind of have to go way back into the 19th century and understand all about the Suez Canal and that, you know, Egypt was a protectorate of England and all of these other things. That's not what this opening narration is about. This opening narration is about the exotic, beautiful, out of this world quality of the place that we are going to be, where we are going to be spending the next couple of hours. And that's something that I also miss in movies today, is this sense of wonder, and we're going to take you someplace you've never been. Although I suppose you could argue that you know, space operas offer that to a certain extent.
Well, this opening is arguably the most artistic part of the entire film. This sequence was made by an interesting filmmaker, photographer, artist named Elliot Ellisothan, who was a kind of a jack of all trades. He was sort of he was also an expert on color photography. He had become a consultant to John Huston's still beautiful movie Moulin Rouge, about Toulouse-Lautrec. And he was a pioneer in color photography. He was associated mainly in his career with Life magazine. He did a lot of photo essays, and he had done a famous one about the Nile. So he was an obvious person to enlist to make this self-contained sequence. And I believe throughout the film you'll see little shots that are probably directed by him that were, you know, made for this opening sequence as well. And Charlton Heston, of course, had just made The Agony and the Ecstasy, which also began with a kind of mini documentary like this. And it's very nice. It is its own separate thing.
I always think that, you know, in the mid-1960s when this footage is being shot, you know, traveling to these regions would have been, you know, a little bit of a challenge, but I mean relatively easy. But we're going to be seeing a film set in the 1880s when traveling to these regions took months and months, and the thought of it, I mean, just literally makes your hair curl.
This is one of the most problematic things just in terms of the plot of the movie and the delays in getting news and knowing exactly what has happened turns up again and again in the movie, where events occur, but the primary players don't know about them till a month later. It's hard to believe, and yet this was how, these foreign wars were conducted throughout this entire period.
And just as we were saying just last week with our Zulu commentary, I mean, here we have another film that begins with a terrible disaster, a loss of 10,000 men. Not all British, though. Some of them are British. The leader was British, was he not?
The leader was British, Colonel William Hicks. He was more or less a kind of glorified mercenary who was hired to head this incredibly large Egyptian army, hired by the Egyptian Khedive to go out and try to defeat this insurgent movement led by the Mahdi, who we will, played by Laurence Olivier, who we will see soon. But the mistake that was made was, very common one. You see it at the beginning of Zulu with the Battle of Isandlwana. You see it in America in almost the same time period, in 1876, with, Custer and the Little Bighorn, where, Western Anglo-type forces, there we have Laurence Olivier
in
as
England.
the Mahdi.
In England, in a studio.
That's right. But anyway, the idea being that the arrogance of the invaders, of the colonialists, has always been that, well, I can take in 2 people and defeat 10,000, and that has never been the case. It's always been ultimately the case when the full force of, sophisticated weaponry is massed against indigenous people. But the idea that they could go in and just have a wholesale victory without being prepared, without having the right weaponry, there have been this kind of like hysterically insane defeats that proved very, very embarrassing for the invaders
It's
throughout history.
interesting that General Gordon himself, before he gets here to Khartoum, and he'd been here before as a government official, he was actually in his 20s, early 20s, was in the Crimea. I believe he was actually at the Battle of Sebastopol. And before he got his nickname Chinese Gordon because he was in the China War in 1860. So he already had a lot of experience of military disasters. He'd certainly seen many of them if he hadn't directly participated in them.
Yeah, in China, obviously, he was more successful. So, the idea that he was this very well-known hero in Britain.
In fact, known as Chinese Gordon.
Yeah. He had been very successful, and actually, as he was called in to Khartoum, he was about to go off to the Congo. So, the idea of these people, these career soldiers who truly made their life's work one war after another. The fact that there were this many wars where they could make names for themselves, it's pretty astonishing.
But of course, unlike Zulu, and this may be a big commercial miscalculation in this film, and I think it's a dramatic miscalculation, is this film starts with a disaster and ends with a disaster. In other words, it's a kind of a one-note story that we're being told, and it doesn't end on a note of triumph, as Zulu does. The battle in Zulu is really a victory, however bitter and sour it may be to the characters at the end. But this one doesn't end in triumph for the hero.
No, and
which is a bad thing for movies generally.
It's very bad. The other thing that I think is actually quite interesting about Khartoum is it portrays the British government in a way that we never see in Zulu. It gives us this calculating, and I actually, in a few minutes we are going to go to England, and we are going to see Prime Minister William Gladstone, played by the incomparable Ralph Richardson, the most eccentric and delightful actor. We are going to see this government as this bunch of Machiavellians kind of like plotting how they are going to get political cover for everything they do. The irony is that their position, Gladstone's position, was actually one that we can approve of today, namely that he's not going to get Britain involved in some new foreign adventure. It's inconsistent because Britain was involved in nothing but foreign adventures for, centuries. But his point of view is one we can agree with, and yet it's played out in such a wicked, evil way that he's almost like rubbing his hands together and slavering over the whole thing. It's funny.
Following up on from Lem's point about how it is a little disappointing for an epic film that it begins with something bad and ends with something bad, I really feel that this film is more about, it could actually have been made as a play. It's really about the political maneuverings that you were talking about, but it's really about how the Mahdi and Gordon are basically the same person.
Mm.
And there's a fiction that we know of in this film, which is that in reality Gordon and the Mahdi did not meet.
Ever.
But it is their conversations together that are, in a sense, the best scenes in the film. And I wish that we saw more of Laurence Olivier as the Mahdi as we are seeing him here. Tell us a bit, this was all shot, his part was shot in England, right, Lem?
Yes, I believe at the very end of the shooting schedule. So everything in the movie was done, and then they went back to England, and for the last couple of weeks they did the Olivier scenes in a studio, and it's all too obvious. Every time they cut to him, the lighting kind of changes, and he's obviously in a studio in England, and they try to make the wider shots with hordes of extras match.
I'm wondering if perhaps it was scheduling difficulties or something, because for me, one of the weaknesses of the narrative is you want to see more of him. But I know that people would say, well, what would he do more? He would just simply invoke the prophet and compare himself to Muhammad, 20 more times. But it is, in fact, his point of view that is very, very interesting. And we don't get enough of really what his point of view is, what his own goals are, as well as Gordon's goals of just really out of being a martinet, defending the position.
Yes, there's an interesting article online about Zulu by someone named Frank Carl, who I should have credited when we spoke about Zulu on that movie. But I'll give him his due here because he makes a point that's pertinent to this film as well. He starts off his article with this. I'll read it. In every violent encounter between alien cultures, history finds one of its most interesting challenges to represent emotional events from a balanced perspective without allowing emotional polemics to distort the historical record. And this is a perfect example of that. That's not to say there's a moral equivalence necessarily between one side and the other, but I think for the purposes of drama, and certainly for an actor like Olivier to interpret a character like the Mahdi, he has to feel that he's not getting short shrift, that he's not just a mustache-twirling villain, And I think the two confrontations between Charlton Heston and Laurence Olivier in this film, they are the best scenes in the film. And I think the reason for its existence, really, and for Robert Ardrey writing it.
Yes. Let's talk about Robert Ardrey, because this is, for me, this is a good screenplay. I mean, it's a very literate screenplay.
I would say it's halfway good. In fact, I'm going to talk a lot about Robert Ardrey. So can I talk about him in a minute? Because
Yes.
I don't want to miss this scene.
Okay.
Because this scene is typical of this movie. It's a very awkward movie, and it's an awkward screenplay. We can talk about the screenplay here. You have all of these interesting actors standing around, sitting around, and none of them are really allowed to become characters. It's very odd. Again, you compare this to like the absolute apex, Lawrence of Arabia, and you'll see the difference.
Oh, yeah.
But so you have a bunch of nice actors standing here, and you never see them again. And I think it's always a mistake. I think Robert Towne, the great screenwriter, said this. It's always a mistake in writing a screenplay to introduce characters who you never see again, unless you really make them outstanding kind of cameos in their own and give them their own vivid vignette. But I'll tell you who these actors are. The gray-haired man standing near Ralph Richardson is Hugh Williams, who was a handsome British leading man of the 30s who never quite achieved top rank. But he was in a couple of classics. He was in Wuthering Heights with Olivier, and he played Steerforth in David Copperfield. And he had not been in a movie in more than a decade when suddenly he appears in this film for some reason. I don't know, as a lark or a favor to a friend. He had become a playwright. He wrote the play with his wife, The Grass is Greener, which became a Stanley Donen film starring Cary Grant and Robert Mitchum. There he is. He's the father of Simon Williams, who's well known as the young rake in Upstairs, Downstairs, James Bellamy. Standing on the other side of Ralph Richardson is Ralph Michael, who is another jobbing actor, as they say in England. There he is. He was probably most famous, just for film buffs, in Dead of Night, the supernatural film, in the Haunted Mirror sequence. And Basil Dearden, our director of Khartoum, was a director of Dead of Night, but he did not direct the Haunted Mirror sequence. The other man standing with a beard is Ronald Lee Hunt, who may be familiar to people in the Steve McQueen movie Le Mans. He was the Porsche team manager who enlists Steve McQueen as a driver. So you see these interesting actors, and they're not in the movie.
They're beards.
They're beards.
Beards and mustaches.
They're cardboard cutouts who are standing around delivering expository dialogue to help you understand the situation that you were talking about, Julie, earlier, that opening sequence doesn't. That's Michael Horder, the balding man, of course, who's familiar from 1,000 British movies, favorite of Richard Lester. And, of course, the stern military guy standing is Nigel Green, who was magnificent in Zulu, and we talked about him when we talked about Zulu. Here, again, he's terribly underutilized. You know, you see him a bit more in the movie, but you don't really get any sense of what an interesting actor he is in this film, because he's not really given an interesting character. And the military man sitting, of course, is Richard Johnson, who was a handsome leading man of this period who, again, never quite reached the front rank. He was another guy, there's an endless list of them, who was almost James Bond. Mm-hmm. But I think Richard Johnson was quite seriously almost James Bond and seems to have really been offered the part and turned it down because he didn't want to be tied into a long-term contract. So Connery got the role. And then Richard Johnson sort of tried to do a kind of a Bond imitation. He was in 2 Bulldog Drummond films of the 60s, which were part of the Bond spy craze. He was married to Kim Novak for 1 year. So it would be interesting if we could talk about that or be a fly on the wall during that marriage, but I don't know anything about it.
They were in it together.
Yes, he was her co-star in Moll Flanders. He's a good actor, but for some reason just didn't carry as a film star. You know, he's a little bit wooden, I would say.
But can I just say in his defense, I agree with you that he's very arrow shirt collar guy in this movie. He is still alive. He's in his mid-80s, and further, he is still working.
Yes, he's done a lot of theater and Shakespeare in particular.
And tons of wonderful television. And he is a most lively older man, still incredibly handsome. In fact, to my mind, handsomer now. But he's got a twinkle now that he did not have then.
Yes, he's much more charismatic in interviews, actually, than he comes off in movie roles, which is strange. And this, of course, is the great Ralph Richardson. And if you'll notice his hand, he's wearing a strange glove on one finger. And that's a historically accurate detail. I don't know what you call that, a finger glove or something, or a sheath, I think. It's because he shot his finger off in a hunting accident. The gun exploded in his hand, and I think the tip of that finger was shot off. So Gladstone actually
not
Richardson. Gladstone, I should clarify, actually did wear that little finger glove.
Gladstone, to me, is a fascinating figure, and particularly as painted here. This is one of the things that I think is so weird about Khartoum. I agree with you, Lem, that they don't quite bring the characters out the way that they might. However, I do like some of the dialogue very much. It's very, very wry. And this scene between the two men, for some reason, Robert Ardrey seems better able to handle, a dialogue between two little duets, I think, better than anything else.
Well, you called it. He's a playwright. He suffers from the flaws of a playwright and the virtues of a playwright. But I think usually more flaws than virtues when we're talking about cinema and screenplays.
Yeah, I think that's true. But Gladstone comes off as very intelligent, which I believe he was, and he was also a very, very shrewd politician, as we know and as we'll see. This whole adventure in Khartoum proved disastrous for him, as he quite honestly knew it would be. And in real life, it brought down his government. However, within 2 years, he was back again, and he served 4 terms as prime minister. So, this was no dummy. But I just wonder if he could possibly, the real life Gladstone could have possibly been as Machiavellian as he is portrayed here, basically saying to Gordon, we've never had this conversation. This is preposterous what you're going to do, and yet I really want you to do it. Okay, go do it. It's a wicked, great little portrayal, and again hints at what might have been if they had been able to or allowed to develop the character of Gordon. I'm not sure why they didn't do it. Just a few years later, you could have an incredibly charismatic yet deeply flawed general in Patton, which is, to me, after Lawrence, the other great movie of this kind. In the real life, Gordon was a flipping nut in many, many ways. Very successful military man, but full of personal quirks that are barely gone into here. George MacDonald Fraser, who wrote, the Royal Flash books, the Flashman novels, also wrote a book about history as viewed by Hollywood, and he was brutal on Khartoum, particularly because he felt, as I think we do, that there was so much more to work with in Gordon, who he called a lunatic. I mean, as we'll see, Gordon was famous for, among other things, walking into desperate situations of battle armed only with a walking cane or something like that, and then thoroughly disarming everyone, metaphorically if not literally, with the force of his personality. And he was such a religious fanatic. He much is made of the fact that he's a Christian here and that God is important to him, which is one of the ways he's twinned with the Mahdi. But apparently his evangelical Christianity extended to beliefs like God's literal throne is situated right above the temple in Jerusalem, and the earth is enclosed in a hollow sphere. Things like that. These are wild. I mean, at least in my mind.
Yeah, it's, again, you should just look at the difference between this film and Lawrence of Arabia. That, in the movie business, there are talented people, and they're few and far between. They're exceptional. And David Lean is one of the great talents. And then there are people who have no talent, and they generally don't have very long careers. And then there's the great big middle of people like the people who made this film, who are just kind of middle of the road, to be generous, craftspeople. You can say that Basil Dearden, the director of this film, is a skilled craftsman on occasion. He's made some good films, but he's not an artist. And unfortunately, this film, I feel that Heston actually is the auteur of this film, that Heston, you get a sense of a commitment from him, and the film is letting him down. And I think he felt that. I think he came on board first. He tried to get Carol Reed to direct it, who he'd just worked with on Agony and the Ecstasy, and he claims Carol Reed didn't want to do another big, long epic. And I'm sure they tried to get, whoever they tried to get when they make lists. I think this began with the producer, and Heston came on board, and they ended up with Basil Dearden. And it's beyond Basil Dearden's abilities, really. And as we saw from the opening, he didn't direct the opening, which is directed by that documentary, photographer, filmmaker. And you may have noted in the credits a very significant credit for the legendary Yakima Canutt as the second unit director. So we can assume that Yakima Canutt directed all the so-called action sequences. So Basil Dearden was really just kind of a traffic cop, I would say, dealing with the actors in these kind of stagey
Just a
scenes.
little bit in his defense, when you said, he had made some good films like, Violent Playground and Victim and The League of Gentlemen.
League of Gentlemen is terrific. That would be my favorite one. A fantastic
Sapphire is one of
caper
my
film.
favorites. Sapphire is great. It seemed like his milieu was London or the urban world of England,
Yes.
The world of crime, whether it was sort of farcical or whether it was quite serious. I mean, Sapphire has got a lot of racism elements in it. He seemed to be better at the kitchen sink drama, Violent
or
Playground.
even film noir. I mean, to me, his universe seems kind of gritty and low down. It's not this big historical epic sweep.
I can imagine that when you're offered something like this, you think, sure, I really got to try to step up. And maybe, there's peer pressure. I mean, I know Lem knows a lot about this from the business today, that, you're always egged on to kind of outdo or do what you're, maybe he's friendly with a couple of the people. Maybe he was friendly with David Lean. We don't know. Maybe he thought, I can do what
He wanted
David
to stretch.
does. Yes, he wanted to stretch. So you get the opportunity. And you do what you can with it. The thing about, and I know that Lem is going to talk at length about Charlton Heston, and Charlton Heston is one of the most fascinating movie stars of the period, I think, because as awkward as that man seems to be sometimes, as martinetish as he is in basically every role, that man had good taste, because he's in some of the best films, or at least some of the best idea-driven films of the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s.
He had unusually good taste in directors. He was unusually interested in artistic directors. And in his diaries, he expresses disappointment in Basil Dearden when he was making this film. But when you look at Heston's other films, and recently he'd made 55 Days at Peking, which is, again, not a success, but it had an extremely interesting artistic director, Nicholas Ray. He recently made Major Dundee with Sam Peckinpah, of course, Touch of Evil with Orson Welles. And these were directors and men who Hollywood disdained and tried to be done with. And Heston, in almost every case, gave them their almost last chance. And I think he respected and liked all of them. So he was interested in getting into it with a real kind of artistic, no matter how difficult the man was. He looked for that and recognized it.
And yet, like so many major movie stars, his persona remains rock-like.
Yeah.
He's
granitic.
Yes, he has a built-in iconography, a sort of a self-constructed edifice that is Charlton Heston.
And I also don't think that you can underestimate the damage done by some of his political stances.
But that's later, though, isn't it?
It's much later, but I think it colors our...
Retrospectively.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's a pity, because that was just silly, and should we really listen to actors when they are speaking politically anyway?
And he may have been led astray. We must mention here the appearance of, is this the solitary woman in the movie, The Belly Dancer?
I think,
And tell us, Lem, who is she?
This is Lisa Giraud, who had recently captured Sean Connery's eye doing the same routine in From Russia with Love. She was only in a couple of movies, just really From Russia with Love. I think she was discovered by Blake Edwards, and she does a similar kind of dance in Days of Wine and Roses in a party scene on a yacht, I think. And she was a professional belly dancer, although I think the preferred term then certainly was Oriental dancing. And I believe she was an English girl who became interested in Oriental dancing and made it her life and profession. I think maybe this was her last film. She may have been in one or two films beyond this, but I think she made a career of belly dancing in casinos and nightclubs all around the world. And I think she's still alive. I think she's been in those, endless James Bond documentaries where they drag people out. I hope I never see another, where the only point in watching them now is to see if Honor Blackman is still hot at 99.
Yeah.
And she is.
She is.
Now, on that subject, Lem, we missed having Julie with us when we were doing Zulu. She couldn't join us that day. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't ask the question. Here is a film. Zulu has the token appearance of Uli Jacobson. withdrawn after about 20, 25 minutes of the picture. And this film, literally outside of the belly dancer's brief appearance, has no women in it at all. Mm-hmm. Women can enjoy, though, can't they, male-oriented action, boys' own adventure films?
Of course they can. Of course they can. The real question is, can women enjoy good movies? Hell yeah. You know, I'm not sure how women got tarred with this brush of, oh, really, they only like, you know, movies with puppies and kittens and rom-coms and blech. You know, I like musicals, but that's not what my tastes are limited to any more than yours are. I mean, you guys like boys' own movies, but you also like musicals, I happen to know.
Very few.
Oh, Lem.
Speak for yourself.
Well, Nick will make up for it. He probably likes more than I do. You know, perhaps it's a result of the fact that I was exposed to a lot of movies. My dad was the one in my family who always took me to movies or showed me movies on TV. And so obviously I saw a lot of action adventure movies when I was very young and got used to them and loved them. But I think, you know, any woman who loves movies would feel exactly the same way. So I think the question to me is, you know, kind of hovers between moot and dopey.
And let's not miss Zaya Muhyiddin here, who was, of course, Lawrence's guide, who gets shot at the well by Omar Sharif in one of the greatest sequences in the history of cinema. Mm. Unfortunately, I don't think he ever repeated that memorable role. He was, again, a jobbing actor. You know, unlike Zulu, Zulu had a whole cast of, as we spoke about, bizarre one-offs and people who had strange, broken careers and lives. And this movie is more normal. All the actors who pop up in this film had long careers in British cinema and television and have lots of credits. Many of them were typecast as sort of villainous Arabs or exotics. And they're usually, you know, quite often they're English actors who are blacked up as the term goes. And it would not be acceptable now. Now you'd have the real people playing these kinds of roles. You know, whenever you talk to English actors and you say, you know, they say they've just been in a movie or a TV show, and you say, really? What did you do? And they just say, oh, it's nothing, a cough and a spit. That's what the parts are in this. Actors pop up and it's just a cough and a spit. It's just nothing. It's nothing really memorable, except for this scene. This is the one scene that comes close to what I said before, where it's a memorable vignette for this guy, and it's a powerful scene. For this very good, you know, striking actor who we remember from Lawrence. And
what strikes me most about it is that it's such a different performance from the one he gives in Lawrence. In Lawrence, he's a kind of humble guy who's won over by Lawrence. They become friends. But it's like a little meek performance, comparatively speaking. In this, he pronounces a curse on Gordon, powerful. Which lasts and comes true. And he has been tragically touched by the martinet hand of Gordon, who executed his son to make a point. Yeah. I also would just like to say that the character he plays, whose name is Zubair, was a real-life guy who was kind of the head of the slave trade in the Sudan. And Gordon, when he was governor general of the Sudan some years earlier, did a remarkable thing, which was he basically eliminated the slave trade. And yet he remained cordial with this man whose trade was eliminated, and he wanted very much to have this guy help him when he went back to Khartoum. And I believe they actually were in league, contrary to this, for a period of time. The other thing having to do with the slave trade, and this is kind of horrible, and it's certainly not in the movie, is that when Gordon, the real-life Gordon, actually got to Khartoum, instead of instantly setting about making a defense of the city against the Mahdi's troops. He thought he was like a guy coming home and going, my house is a wee bit messy. I think I'll clean up before I do anything else. So he decided to re-administer the city of Khartoum and discovered that the economy was very slack there. So in order to perk up the economy, he reinstituted the slave trade. In other words, this is a guy who, although he professed to have these great Christian beliefs, he could be flexible about them.
Well, I think that was a matter of political expediency, rather like Gladstone's machinations. I think what Gordon probably thought was, I can make the economy better. Reinstating slavery is a way to go around it. It also gives me support. It gave him support in the town that he badly needed.
Politics.
Well, speaking of politics, the other actor we saw in that Zaya Muhyiddin scene is the good actor Alexander Knox, who's most famous for playing President Wilson many years before this in the 20th Century Fox movie, Wilson. And then he was blacklisted in the McCarthy years, which is why he would have been in England and appeared in many British films like this, almost always typecast as kind of American political type figures like ambassadors. He plays the U.S. ambassador to Russia in Nicholas and Alexandra, another very literate playwright's screenplay, which I like very much, and also available from Twilight time, we should add. And name the Sam Peckinpah film he was in. Via Rides.
Oh, Via Rides.
In which he was a president again. He was President Madero of Mexico in that film. So he was always those kind of an American. He was Canadian, I think, actually. He was in a lot of Joseph Losey films in England, another American blacklistee who found work in England at that time.
Since you just brought up Sam Peckinpah, let's talk about Robert Ardrey, I know you want to, and his connection to Peckinpah, or rather the influence that he had on Sam Peckinpah.
Well, Robert Ardrey, who wrote the screenplay for this film, and he was nominated for an Oscar for this film. A recent critic said, incredibly, this screenplay was nominated for an Oscar. And I think as we were saying, it's a literate screenplay. It's intelligent, as all his screenplays were. He was obviously a very intelligent, interesting man. But it is a bit incredible. But it's not that incredible when you realize, and I hate to shock anyone, I assume everyone's sitting down, but there is a lot of politicking involved in Oscar nominations.
I know.
Since Mr. Redman is an Oscar nominee among us. But Robert Ardrey, what's very curious about Robert Ardrey and him being the screenwriter of this film is that he wrote many films. He was a very successful screenwriter, having been a playwright. His most notable play, which became a very good movie, which I don't think he wrote the script of, was Thunder Rock, a very unusual film starring Michael Redgrave. And kind of semi-famous play that I think is still revived from time to time. It's sort of a minor classic. I recommend it, Thunder Rock. I think his best film by far was a Western called The Wonderful Country, starring Robert Mitchum. Fantastic movie. Similar to this in that, like all of Robert Ardrey's scripts, very slow-moving and talky. And again, it betrays the fact that he's a playwright. But also about a divided self, a divided character who doesn't quite know where he belongs. Robert Mitchum plays a kind of rootless drifter who's sort of half Mexican and half American. It's not unlike the Gordon character here, who became known as Gordon of Khartoum. And I think they refer in this movie to his beloved Khartoum. And, he's like Lawrence as well, and the greatest divided character of all. There's that line with Zaya Muhyiddin in Lawrence where his guide says, are you not loyal to England? And Lawrence, as played by Peter O'Toole, says, to England and to other things. And that's very much the Gordon character here. In fact, Gordon is mentioned in Lawrence as well, I think, in Alec Guinness's tent. Alec Guinness says to Lawrence, I think you're another of these desert-loving English, like Gordon of Khartoum. Or, so it's an English type. But anyway, the interesting, bizarre thing about Robert Ardrey is, as successful a screenwriter as he was, his most famous movies are the ones that his name is not on. And it's not because he rewrote them, which is common in the screenwriting trade, without credit. It's because he influenced them. He was a huge influence on Sam Peckinpah, most notably Straw Dogs, and also Kubrick, 2001, which we've already mentioned, and especially A Clockwork Orange. Because Robert Ardrey, at the beginning of the 60s, while he was still a screenwriter in Hollywood, went back to his first love, which was anthropology, and wrote a series of books of social anthropology. The first one was called African Genesis, and the second one, perhaps the best and most famous, is called The Territorial Imperative. And his thesis, which was quite controversial then and now probably, although it's maybe perhaps a little bit dated now, but it was kind of sensational at the time, and he became famous not because of his Hollywood career or his playwriting career, but because of these books. His thesis was that man is descended from killer apes. I think his sort of famous quote is something along the lines of, "We were not born of fallen angels, but of risen apes. And those apes were armed killers besides." And this was a huge influence, for obvious reasons, on Sam Peckinpah and on Kubrick.
Yeah, the idea being that violence
Is innate.
and not only innate, but also contributed to human evolution.
Exactly. And that the idea that man is a noble savage is a complete fallacy, and that society can be changed to influence man is completely backwards. So now we would view this as the difference between a conservative and a liberal. That a liberal, what Ardrey indeed called environmentalists, when in those days it didn't mean carbon emissions. It meant someone who believes the environment can be changed in order to affect man. In fact, the opposite is true, according to Ardrey and Sam Peckinpah and Stanley Kubrick. You can't change man by changing socioeconomic, conditions. So Marxism or liberalism or leftism is a fallacy. You have to change man's values because man is innately brutal and aggressive and animalistic. And so this film really, in a sense, is a very simple dramatization of that, of two warring tribes fighting over territory. Ardrey believed that, dogs bark at each other across a fence for the same reason that men go to war. It's almost always about territory, and aggression comes from protecting and defending and acquiring territory. So this film is kind of an epic version of Straw Dogs, which is a very minor, micro version of the same theme of someone being under siege,
Although I think what's interesting is that added to that, which you're absolutely right, that's the essential. But both of these characters, Gordon and the Mahdi, are men who have chosen to cover their aggression, their violence, their innate violence, with this godly cloak. Both claim that they are operating in the name of their gods. They're very disparate gods. And this is one of the things that, again, as you said, Lem, that, there's this, or maybe Nick, you said it, maybe you both said it, the twinning of these two characters, that they are these aggressive individuals who lead whole nations into war, but in the name of God.
Well, as you said earlier, Julie, it's not as good as it could be because whether it was perhaps Charlton Heston, the way he wanted to work through the character, he doesn't go as far. We don't see that he is as obsessed as the Mahdi is.
No, to get back to what Julie was saying about Patton and Lawrence, which again are the absolute top of the line biopic examples, I think it's very hard to write a true story. I've gotten trapped myself into writing true stories, and I loathe them. I always swear never again. You feel like you're in a straitjacket when you're dealing with the truth. However you change it, however you take liberties with it or dramatize it, you're still stuck with the truth, and you can't deviate as far as you'd like to. And somehow fiction, I think you can go deeper into character in fiction and make something more real that's more felt in a fictional story than you ever can in a true story. I think if you Dr. Zhivago is a lesser movie, a lesser achievement than Lawrence of Arabia. but I think you're in the shoes of Omar Sharif as Dr. Zhivago more than you ever are even in something as great as Lawrence. I think with a true story, you're always watching it at a remove. You're never quite in the shoes of the character. You're never quite totally involved or engaged in the fantasy, as I am when I watch Charlton Heston in Major Dundee, or or Planet of the Apes as the character, Taylor in Planet of the Apes. Somehow you can do something with a fictional character that there's always a window with a true life story like this. You're looking at it through a window rather than going through the window yourself. There's always that pane of glass, I feel.
Although I would argue that with the great ones like Lawrence and Patton, the window is huge, and the glass, you can almost put your hand through it without getting hurt.
But those achievements are so exceptional.
They are exceptional.
Here's another actor blacked up in this ridiculous fashion. Douglas Wilmer is Olivier's main right-hand guy. He has a scene to himself later on with Heston, and he was probably most famous as a Sherlock Holmes. He has one of those Sherlock Holmes noses on British television, but he was in all of these movies. He was in El Cid and Cromwell and The Fall of the Roman Empire and Cleopatra. In fact, Cleopatra, when I was reading about this film online, it's this scene in particular. Someone on one of those film music boards thought that they detected in watching this film an early use of temp tracks, which Nick can talk about, because they feel that there are sequences where you can sort of hear what the temp track might have been. And this one, most notably, someone said is Alex North's Cleopatra music.
Yes, especially, I know what they're talking about. It's like that clarinet kind of sinuous, winding. That is a little like Cleopatra. Huh.
Well, that's very interesting. Whilst temp tracks, which for those that may not know is when a movie is being edited and before the score has been written for the film as a sort of a guide to the composer, although the composer doesn't really want this guide, music that exists already from other movies is laid into the temp dub and then shown to people with the temp dub, and it traps the composer into doing something similar to the music that has been presented to people. That is more of a curse than a blessing. It was certainly less prevalent then than it is now, where every movie is temp tracked. But it's quite possible. And maybe because Frank Cordell was not typically a big epic composer that they wanted to indicate to him a feel or a feeling, a kind of direction that they felt the music should go in.
It's pure exotica, and it's great.
I want to stick up a little bit for Frank Cordell's work here. I mean, I know that he's not up there with the traditional greats that we love and talk about all the time, but if this was sort of outside of his wheelhouse, as they say, this is a pretty valiant effort at doing something that may be regarded as a little derivative, but he's got the grammar of it. Mm-hmm. Like all arrangers do, they have the language. He speaks the language.
It's fine. I certainly would not fault the score. One of the things I think I just have been looking at the screen, wonder of wonders, and look how tiny Olivier looks next to Charlton Heston. It is astonishing. I always think of Olivier as big. That's how he projects. But if you actually look at them standing next to each other, it's shocking.
I think he was a man of sort of average height, 5'8" or 9".
Well, what is Heston, like 6'5"?
6'4", probably. I mean, he's a big man. You mentioned noses earlier, and I thought, that's a cue to start talking about Larry, because we love him, and he loved putting on noses. He loved putting on paint.
You know what? It's a syndrome. The handsomest actors that we have seem obsessed with obscuring their beauty with beards and fake noses and walnut face makeup. Olivier had just done Othello, so it was like maybe his face was dyed. He couldn't get it all off after Othello. It's shocking to me. I don't really quite understand it, except that maybe if they are serious actors, as certainly Olivier was, they feel like they're not taken seriously enough. Although, how could Laurence Olivier feel he wasn't taken seriously enough?
It's all about insecurity. They're the first to tell you that they can't act unless they put on the funny noses or or figure out how the character walks, or they're afraid to be themselves. It's the worst thing that you can say to an actor is, don't act, stop acting, be yourself. And I think someone like Olivier was quite explicit about that whenever he spoke about the craft of acting. He was insecure, like many great actors are. You think they're projecting nothing but confidence, but it's actually a lack of confidence in a way. There's that famous anecdote where someone went to visit him backstage after one of his legendary performances, of Hamlet. Like, you had to have been there. It was the greatest thing I've ever seen, and found him sobbing in his dressing room and said, "Larry, my God, what's happened?" And he just was inconsolable. And the friend visiting said, "But you were magnificent. That was the greatest thing I've ever seen." And Olivier said, "Yes, but I don't know how I did it." It's something magic that they're...
I have to say, I absolutely love the Olivier of this period and later. I know that by now he has sort of decided that his sort of leading man days are behind him, and he wants to be a sort of a show up for a week or two and put on the
Grab
wig,
the paycheck,
and do it. And he was criticized at the time for it. But one of the most underrated things about him, I always think, is he always makes me laugh. I find him funny. No matter how serious he is, he will always do something that is funny. Like in this film, when he is pointing out how he resembles, that Muhammad, he will point to a thing on his face and a space between his teeth.
And he says space.
And he says a space. And he's funny. I mean, that is a funny moment, typical of him. And as we know, later after this, he would, descend more into, he would be in Marathon Man, he would be in The Boys from Brazil, and he would become very well known as an older man for being that kind of Middle European bad guy character. Sleuth is a huge achievement that he did in the early 1970s.
Don't forget the Betsy.
We won't forget
and not MacArthur, but he played MacArthur.
Yes, he played MacArthur.
He played MacArthur.
That's
just nuts.
Which was ludicrous. But no, I think what you mean by funny is entertaining. He's always entertaining. He's totally watchable.
Yep.
I mean, that's why he's the greatest actor of all time, because everything he's doing is imaginative and interesting.
Yes.
It's like watching Charles Laughton, a handful of actors, no matter what they're in, whether it's absolute crap or even if you might say they're being hammy, they're fascinating and riveting to watch. And I've always felt this way about him in this movie. He has been criticized for it, now more than ever, because of the forces of political correctness. It's just, it's so outrageous that someone would be made up like this. But I think it's a marvelous performance. I think he shows why he's the greatest in this.
No, I couldn't agree more. I just think he's phenomenal.
And Heston is very good, too. I used to think it was as good a British accent as any American has ever done. I don't think that anymore. I watched it recently for this, and I thought, what was I ever thinking? It's very spotty.
It comes and it goes.
It comes and it goes, and it's virtually impossible for an American to do it right, and virtually impossible for an English person to do an American accent perfectly. But I think it's easier for English actors than it is for Americans for some reason. Maybe because English people have seen more Hollywood movies than Hollywood movie stars have seen British films.
And because they think American accents are so hilarious.
But as I said, there's a commitment with Heston here. He believes in this character and these types of characters because he did specialize in these kind of martinets and the loneliness of command. It was something he loved. He did like playing leaders. It's why I say he's a kind of an undersung auteur, because he selected the films that he did, like all movie stars do. They're the ones with the power to decide this movie's going to get made because I'm going to accept it, and I'm the money. But just as we saw, just in the recent films he made around this, 55 Days at Peking and Major Dundee, I mean, time and time again, he liked this loneliness of command and showing those private moments of a public man repeately.
And he carried it off, I think, better than almost anyone else. I mean, retroactively now, people think, oh, he's a bit of a bit wooden. I know that Julie thinks that he was you think he was a very
fit.
well-built
Fit is the
man.
polite way of putting it. I will say that in an era when, working out was not the everyday thing that it is today. And, today people talk about, Brad Pitt's six-pack and stuff. In the 50s, 40s, men were allowed to be kind of just normal. They could have a little soft belly or whatever. Fine. Charlton Heston, who routinely stripped down in his movies, had an incredible body. I don't know if he worked out, if it was just luck or what, but he has always struck me as being like an anachronism in that way. I know it's such a terrible girly thing to say, but
No, and
it's
again,
noticeable.
It was noticeable and, again, unusual for a movie star to strip down to almost nothing like he did in film after film, particularly
Yes.
Planet of the Apes, when he's wearing that little Tarzan loincloth. Other than in Tarzan movies, you didn't normally see proper movie stars doing that. I think he even had a butt shot in that, didn't he, in Planet of the Apes, where they really treat him like an animal, which was
And
very
when you think of
startling
his
at the
when you
time.
think of his age, I mean, movie stars of this period, they always looked older, didn't they, than they do today. Now everyone looks very young, but he would have been around 42 when this film was being shot, and yet he could be sort of any age in this.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think there's, now that we're watching him with Richard Johnson here, there is, I would say, definitely a homoerotic vibe to this screenplay, which I think was intentional. Again, so many movies exist in the shadow of some other movie. And as Julie started out by saying, this is so much in the shadow of Lawrence of Arabia, such a kind of obvious attempt to piggyback on the success and acclaim of Lawrence. And it hits all the same notes, the divided character who's loyal to England and other things, as I said, and the character we saw in the previous scene who he's going to have to execute, just like Lawrence has to execute someone he feels bad about, but he has to because he's the commander. And it does extend to Lawrence's homoerotic thing here, I think, with the relationship with Richard Johnson, which is a bit odd. And it is because they're too old, or Richard Johnson is too old. I haven't researched the actual character Richard Johnson is playing, Stuart. I imagine he was probably younger. I don't know.
He was certainly younger than Gordon, who I believe was in his early 50s, I think.
Yes, and Gordon, one of the things about the real Gordon, which seems to be known about his eccentricities and perversities, was that he did have a lot of young boys around him all the time.
And he was unmarried.
Unmarried, and they do make a point of that.
They do. He at some point he says something like, "I've been introduced to
hundreds of women, and none of them have interested me." He doesn't exactly say that, but that's what it means.
But you know what's surprising, Lem, is that I think Lawrence is much more open about the homoerotic qualities in its hero, and it was made earlier. It's like they're skirting around it and very shy about it. Here, in a film that was made later, when presumably they had more opportunity to play with that, as it were.
No, I think
And that I find kind of puzzling, except that perhaps that was Heston. Remember, Heston famously in Ben-Hur was completely unaware of the attraction between himself and Masala.
that's another famous, funny joke, which actually began as a Laurence Olivier, Ralph Richardson anecdote, where Olivier and Richardson were in a play together, and the director conspired with Olivier to introduce vibes to the relationship and said, "But for God's sake, don't tell Ralph." And then Gore Vidal, who was working on the script of Ben-Hur, appropriated that joke and claims to have, again, added overtones to that screenplay, conspiring with the director, William Wyler, but said, for God's sake, Wyler supposedly said, "For God's sake, don't tell Chuck." Because Heston did have this image in real life of being kind of obtuse, and they didn't want to tell him what was really going on in the scenes.
Do you have any real sense of what he was like as a man?
Heston?
Yes.
I think he was a terribly decent, nice guy. Orson Welles said, the nicest man in show business you could ever meet. And I've never heard anything bad about him in terms of any misbehavior on the set or diva-like behavior or martinet-like behavior. I think he was very well liked by everyone who worked with him.
I've heard, I have to say, I have never heard anything to counter that at all. There is a commentary on one of the Ben-Hur releases in which Heston talks about his experience making the movie. And he's a little, should we say, unimaginative.
Well, he's pompous. I think the worst anyone's ever said about him was he's a bit pompous and arrogant, like the characters he plays, you know? And maybe a little dismissive of lesser actors who are around. He wanted to hobnob and have lunch with, you know, Larry and Ralph, and maybe give short shrift to underlings in a bit, but that's entirely in keeping with his persona.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here, unfortunately, the lower budget quality of the film rears its ugly head with some bad process shots. There are not many, but
I would also say that this is, you know, it's funny. You begin to have an alternate movie. You know, you were talking before, Lem. You have an alternate movie in your head because you try to imagine really what this might have been, particularly in comparison to something like Lawrence or Patton. And this is one of those areas where I kind of wish that they had had a bigger budget or that there had been more imaginative use of these actual facts. There's a very short and not very thrilling sequence here that could have been like, you know, something out of The Bridge on the River Kwai, to name another lean, you know, where Gordon actually connected the White Nile and the Blue Nile to make a moat around Khartoum in its defense. Well, you know, you see a ditch open and some water pours in here. It's not very, again, spectacular, and yet the opportunity was conceivably there. The same thing happens later in the film where you have a little sequence where he's trying to show a few underlings how to make a kind of primitive mine.
I know, it's kind of pathetic, isn't it?
It's pathetic, and in reality, there was very extensive and quite clever mining of the whole area around Khartoum. This is one of the reasons that the siege lasted 10 months. It wasn't just that the Nile was high. It was that the whole area was really quite well defended. How else do you keep a siege going for 10 months if you're the ones under siege?
And that would have been a more interesting story, probably,
Yes.
to tell. And you could have gotten in all the backstory that was necessary by keeping it more confined and contained to that simple siege story.
The siege.
If it was tightened to that degree.
Yeah.
You know, it's always easier to write a screenplay that takes place over 24 hours, 48 hours, 2 weeks than it is over a period of time, a longer period of time, the more difficult it becomes. And again, that's another, you know, difference between Zulu and this film.
yes.
Yeah, Zulu respects the Aristotelian
Unities.
Yes.
And this is so obviously a cheesy miniature model.
Oh, shoot, I wasn't even going to say that.
I know.
And there's an extraordinarily inept sequence still to come, which should be a big, exciting battle sequence. And it's as bad as anything I've seen in a movie that should be a big, expensive roadshow blockbuster, with mismatched shots, and it almost lowers itself to the Ed Wood level. I mean, it's really ridiculous.
Or actually to one of our other favorite films that was made just a couple of years later, McKenna's Gold.
Yes, it's like
which
that.
was also billed as a huge widescreen epic and has some of the cheapest special effects that you will ever see.
It's the kind of thing that led to the decline and the end of films like this, because it is anachronistic. I mean, this is a 1966 film, and just think of what was happening in England, say, just in England, let alone the world, society at this time. I mean, this is the kind of film that in a few short years, the Monty Pythons would be satirizing. It was still this odd time where England, for instance, was celebrating these kind of military heroes from the Victorian age. At the same time, the society was undergoing a revolution, and these characters were becoming figures of ridicule. It actually started earlier than that. The best short biographical portrait of Gordon is in a famous book called Eminent Victorians, which was published in 1918, which was almost like an early work of modernism, at that time, where people were starting to look back at these figures in British history who were glorified and puncturing those legends and myths. Because so many of them now do seem to have been nutcases, So you can present Lawrence of Arabia as, and even in that film, it's explicitly, again, said in the film, people say, this guy's nuts, more or less.
A funny idea of fun.
This film is leaning the other way. It's leaning more towards the old-fashioned, Boy Scout, Baden-Powell kind of figure that Graham Chapman would soon be mocking in Monty Python, as kind of military colonels and majors and judges, and so it's an odd film to have appeared in the midst of the swinging 60s.
Well, it was also a very turbulent time in the movie business as well, in Britain particularly, because, as we had mentioned a little bit in the Zulu commentary, by 1968, the American studios, who all had power bases, European set power bases, would up sticks and move back to America, leaving the local industry in a great deal of trouble, and that had to do with a lot of tax issues and the government assistance that those companies were being given to be given motivation to make films in Europe. All of that was going to be taken away by 1968, and there was a real collapse.
Yeah, and it does remind me of other films, other kind of cinerama movies like Battle of the Bulge, which I happen to love, and the much worse film Custer of the West, where, like this film, there are these big, supposedly big action sequences that are shoehorned in to this more intimate play about Gordon and the Mahdi, and nothing really fits. That's why it is a bit strange that it was nominated for an Academy Award, because it's not a coherent or cohesive screenplay. The so-called big sequences aren't really well integrated with the rest of the movie. They're just sort of popped in for the purposes of having a trailer. In fact, speaking of trailers, Charlton Heston says in his diaries when he first met Ralph Richardson on this film for the first time, Ralph Richardson, or Rafe maybe is the more correct English pronunciation, who is a well-known total eccentric, said to Charlton Heston, I remember you. I've seen you in trailers, meaning previews.
Did he mean previews, or did he mean,
meaning the preview.
welcome wagons?
And Heston said on another occasion he saw Ralph Richardson pull up to the studio in his Bentley and get out, and he patted the hood or the bonnet of the Bentley, and he said, "Goodbye, old chap. See you later, or back in a while."
He was a great, great character.
He was. Can I tell Ralph Richardson's story?
Yes, absolutely.
I can't help myself. Apparently, Ralph Richardson went to the theater one night and in the middle of the performance stood up and said, "Is there a doctor in the house?" And a man stood and identified himself as a doctor. And Richardson said, "Doctor, have you ever seen such an awful play?" If only that were true. Just to go back to our discussion of, the potential of real life characters versus the way that they're sometimes realized in movies. In this sequence we have, the Mahdi's troops attempting to overrun the supplies that are being taken into Khartoum by Gordon. And once again, we don't see the Mahdi because he's back in London. But I do think that one of the things that they did quite right in this was to cast an incredibly charismatic actor as the Mahdi. That is, close to what the reality was. If you have any curiosity at all about the Mahdi and modest Islam and so forth, there's tons of information out there. But what I find interesting is that this actual character, Muhammad Ahmad was his name, And he, like Lawrence, was from a relatively humble background. His father was a boat builder, which I guess you could argue in the region of the Nile makes him, a little more important than he might have been elsewhere. But he kind of rose through the ranks of various fakirs and other religious figures in the region, and one day just announced that he was Muhammad's expected one, the Mahdi. And he was so charismatic that he began to draw people around him. Now, of course, he was also a big Sudanese nationalist as well as everything else. Poor Sudan had been overrun by the Egyptians, by the Turks, and of course by the British. And one of the things that he pledged, in addition to purifying Islam, was, and taking it back to, its Sharia law. Actually, the echoes here with where we are today are a little strange.
Well, that's the elephant in the room, of course,
is
the innocence with which we viewed this film in 1966.
Exactly.
And the horrible relevance it now has watching it.
I've actually read one piece which compared the Mahdi to Osama bin Laden.
Of course.
So, he was a fascinating character, incredibly bloodthirsty, but again, in the name of his God. And one little side note, one little piece of trivia that I cannot resist is that one of his descendants is the actor Alexander Siddig, who is probably could start his own holy war, peopled by fangirls from the internet. He was on Deep Space Nine, and he was in Syriana. He's in a wonderful movie called Cairo Time, and he's sort of living proof that charisma is a genetic inheritance.
See, this particular shot and moment would seem terribly indebted to Lawrence. That's that moment of the bloodshed, and the character having a private moment with himself, really, before Richard Johnson shows up next to him.
And I think this is also, I might be wrong, I think the part where he says to Stuart, well, you just go back and
leave me alone.
And we're back with the travel again. It's like, spend the next month, going back to Britain to report on what has happened. That's also the incredible thing that we mentioned at the beginning of the Zulu commentary. It took weeks for the War Office back in London to know that any of these disasters had happened. It took weeks before they found out. And by then, the people in charge of the disaster had time to figure out who to blame and how to rewrite the history so it all came off better. Last word about Alexander Siddig, we must point out that his mother is Malcolm McDowell's sister.
See? Again, these families.
So Malcolm is related to the Mahdi, is what you're telling us.
Kind of.
I think this is where Richard Johnson also says a quintessential Heston line. He says to Heston, "Suspicion still exists that you've created a situation to fit your own personal inclinations." Which is, again, you think, well, that's what movie stars do.
Oh, yeah. And apparently generals.
But you're right. The relevance to today makes Robert Ardrey and makes his script it confirms what a futurist he really is. And I'll read you what Sam Peckinpah had to say about Robert Ardrey in Sam Peckinpah's notorious Playboy interview. Playboy says, many people, this was at the time of Straw Dogs, so that was the subject of controversy at that moment, this extraordinarily violent film, just as A Clockwork Orange was. It's interesting that it's always fascists, by the way, who accuse filmmakers of making fascist films. And then the filmmakers...
Pauline Kael a fascist.
And then the filmmakers respond. And it's what Kubrick and Malcolm McDowell were doing. They wrote letters to the editor. The famously reclusive Stanley Kubrick took pen in hand to refute the charges of fascism against A Clockwork Orange, and he invoked Robert Ardrey, as Peckinpah does in this interview with Playboy. Playboy says, many people want to put a stop to whatever on television or movie screens could contribute to the public violence of our time. Are they wrong? And Peckinpah replied, I think it's wrong and dangerous to refuse to acknowledge the animal nature of man. That's what Robert Ardrey is talking about in those 3 great books of his, African Genesis, The Territorial Imperative, and The Social Contract. Ardrey's the only prophet alive today.
Sounds like
Speaking of
Peckinpah.
prophets. And then he goes on, some years ago when I was working on The Wild Bunch, a friend of mine came to me with African Genesis. I believe it was Strother Martin,
It sure
character
was.
actor, and said I had to read it because Ardrey was writing about what I was dealing with, that we were both on the same track. So after I finished Wild Bunch, I read him and I thought, wow, here's somebody who knows a couple of nasty secrets about us.
Earlier, your distillation, I thought, of what those books are about was an incredible primer for anyone listening to this commentary that does not know anything about that. You know, what you said was about as handy-dandy a, shorthand version of it as you could ever hear.
The other thing that I think is fascinating is that there was a period of time in this country when works of paleoanthropology were bestsellers.
Yes, that's
Even
a
in
good point.
England in the 60s, Desmond Morris, The Naked
Yes,
Ape.
Naked
I
Ape
mean, that was
the other
hugely famous.
famous
That was
title
huge
of
here,
that
too.
day. Yeah, it was written in layman's language, these Robert Ardrey books.
Pop
So
sci.
it was pop anthropology, and that's why he was so disdained by the scientific establishment, because he was considered, a layman treading on their territory, literally. But he's also greatly respected and has had a huge influence on that field.
Desmond Morris actually went on to write a book which I always found interesting, which is about the violent tribal nature of football fans. You know, he was even equating that sort of tribal ritual and need to, have violent conflict with someone from the opposing tribe as all part of that same structure and framework.
Makes sense to me.
And I've always found it interesting, having grown up in England. There's a huge anti-American feeling among many English people. And you think of, I don't know if this point has ever been made, it must have been. You think about Straw Dogs and A Clockwork Orange, and that they were both banned on video in England for so long, and they're accused of being fascist works, and they're such famous, violent films. And what are they about? They're both about England. And the anti-Americans in England are always going on about, America, the cowboy culture of America, and the violent country of America. And, only in America would presidents be killed and assassinated, at the rate they are in this country. And what are we looking at? We're looking at a movie about British imperial violence, which is one of 1,000. And as I mentioned on the Zulu track as well, what were they? That was their frontier. They were going off and having these Wild West battles with Indians every bit as much, if not more so, than Americans were.
It was never ending. I think you mentioned a really interesting book, Lem, on that Zulu track called Victoria's Little Wars. Yeah. Which is, basically the premise of it is, for her entire reign, which was 60-something years, it never stopped.
No.
The constant wars.
As we said on that track, it was basically 60 to 70 years from the 1840s right through to the 1910s, and then you went right into World War I. So, it didn't stop. And that little island, one of the sort of social tropes that we often hear about to excuse. When I first moved to America in the late 80s, it always used to amuse me that the American idea of Britain was sort of like the Avengers. It was like, gentlemen and ladies and everyone stopped for tea and everything, whereas the London I grew up in was one of people getting bottles in the face and a completely hostile and dangerous atmosphere. That was the world that I saw at school. And so that idea of not being in a war for all those years, they can't help themselves. They've got to, in a sense, war with each other all the time, which takes us back to the football violence, which was a natural outlet for people who were war-deprived, was the idea.
War-deprived.
Or the troubles in Northern Ireland, which then came back to London. And I think Nick had a close-hand experience of that. I remember restaurants being boarded up during my childhood in London because bombs could be thrown through them at any moment. And you had a much more explicit
Well, I did
experience with
in
it.
1976. It was at the Ideal Home exhibition in Earl's Court, London. I was actually there when a bomb went off. The IRA guy had simply thrown a bundle of dynamite into a waste paper basket at the top of an escalator. So it went off and blew everyone down the escalator, and everything collapsed around it. And it was it was the kind of scene that you don't forget, because when the smoke clears, when you read in the newspaper that a bomb went off, you think, oh, a bomb went off and several people were killed. But when the smoke clears, just like with the Boston bombings, America had a first-hand experience earlier this year. When the smoke clears, you see the legs and the arms and all of the devastation. And it's an incredible, sickening wake-up call that this is what violence is all about, and these are the consequences.
And just as the Americans love Westerns as an escape and a fantasy, this is the British version of that. At the same time, a movie like Lawrence maybe shows you, or Zulu shows you, the other face of war and the bloodshed and the bitterness of it. It's also, these movies were celebrating it. They were celebrating the military virtues. And they always had a kind of nostalgic element, certainly for the British people, who continually made them and went to them in droves during the 1960s. Because again, like Zulu, this film was not particularly successful in America commercially.
No. And, and like today, outside of the, the relevance of the overall situation, we're living in a strange time, I think, where a sort of a patriotism, where a kind of a real scandalous patriotism is being used as a disguise for something else.
It's a faux patriotism. It's not real patriotism.
And I think, we saw in an earlier scene here in Khartoum, people with placards, demonstrating against the war. The reason that
they're not demonstrating. In fact, they want the war. They want
the relief
the relief expedition to go out. And so what's happening is that the Gladstone government, which didn't want a foreign adventure, is being pressured into.
Right. The overall point, though, I wanted to make there was the fact that the reason that Disraeli, lost his prime ministership after the Anglo-Zulu War, and Gladstone lost his election after this one is at various points in history as colonial and as expeditionary, the country is. There are segments of the public that don't like it. There were people even then in the 1880s that wished that we weren't doing it, that wished that we weren't going out there for these needless wars, which is, like the Iraq War, you're going after some trophy, some land, some oil, whatever it may be. And at the end of it, when it's all over, what have you got? You've got, 10,000 dead and nothing.
I think it's interesting that in England, certainly, they were able to withstand a century of constant warfare. And then, as you pointed out, once they went into World War I, they saw an entire generation of young men destroyed. And it was at that point, I think, that a real anti-war movement rose up in England. But the fact that they were able to withstand as much sacrifice as they did, part of it was the lure of the British Empire, which, again, by the time of World War I, that was beginning to diminish and die. So you could be incredibly warlike as long as you felt there were some rewards and that these lovely red coats would be, in place around the world.
Well, you're about to see the figure most notorious and infamous in regard to recruiting those legions of young men who went to their doom in the trenches. Kitchener, who was originally known as Kitchener of Khartoum, before he became the famous General Kitchener of World War I, famous for the recruiting poster where he's pointing a finger directly at you and saying, your country needs you. That poster, in the annals of propaganda is as potent an image for, the sacrifice and the cannon fodder that millions of young men became then and ever since, really, that attraction to war. And of course, we've seen that poster reproduced in any number of different contexts. That
The Uncle Sam poster.
yeah, exactly. The pointing finger.
We should also say, too, that, I mean, the people, we said earlier that the government didn't know, about the disaster until a few weeks later, or they didn't know the details. So what does the average person know in the 1880s? They're so removed, they're reading a newspaper if they're lucky, that's all, and months after the event happened.
I think that's true, and also the truth is that just like today, many of the news outlets were, manipulating the facts so as to give themselves the best stories. People certainly knew about Gordon being trapped in Khartoum. What they didn't know was, by choice, he wanted to be there and refused to leave. I mean, this is another way in which to me Gordon resembles Patton. He was given orders and he just blatantly refused to obey them. He had his own means and methods, whatever the cause. There's some interesting things proposed, I think, in the movie. And there's some other interesting things in real life that might indicate why he remained in Khartoum against direct orders from his government. He was a real rebel. And that was not the story that the newspapers chose to tell. The story that they chose to tell was, our gallant hero trapped. Why is our government? And remember, most of these newspapers were conservative, not liberal. Gladstone was a liberal. And I'm talking capital L, capital C, the parties. So these newspapers wanted to put Gladstone in an awkward position. And in fact, and I think this is mentioned in the film, he very narrowly escaped being censured in Parliament because people felt, well, you're not acting, you're not getting our beloved hero Gordon out of Khartoum. Well, he just didn't want to get England involved in yet another thing where, the biggest interest was the Suez Canal, which had been a gigantic British interest since it was constructed in the 1860s, and would become steadily more and more important until it finally blew up in their faces in the 50s. It is fascinating to note all these different forces at work, how long it took for the news to get through, how the news was manipulated, how people felt. There was this sort of myth of the British Empire and the ultimate invincibility despite, all kinds of ghastly defeats that could endure was amazing. And again, looking for an example of press manipulation that was inspired, in that case, by the government. Look at Zulu. The Battle of San Juana was thousands of troops lost, and yet that sort of was pushed aside to make room for, the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which, in which, only, 17 people were killed? Hurrah! And they beat off a troop of 4,000. Never mind that Rorke's Drift meant nothing, had no strategic value at all.
Right. Well, they were able to spin the, quote, victory of Rorke's Drift against the bad news that had happened, earlier in the day. And it's ironic, I think, that another thing that puts Zulu and Khartoum together is that it is almost 6 years to the day after Rorke's Drift that Gordon is killed in Khartoum.
I don't think the idea of press manipulation and propaganda and media spin, I think that's one thing that hasn't changed at all. And it is interesting that it is part of these stories. And it's part of the movies, usually. We have Arthur Kennedy in Lawrence of Arabia as the myth maker, journalist, American journalist, who creates the legend of Lawrence of Arabia. I mean, the title is partly ironic. And you have a minor, again, it's the difference between a great film and this kind of weak film, that you have a representative of the press who's a character in this, and yet he's not a character. He just pops up as a cardboard figure like so many others. Frank Power, who's going to meet a bad end, as we will see. Again, played by a guy who's been in a million movies, Jerome Willis, I think his name is, but again, not a really famous name, just another jobbing actor, as they say.
Talk a little bit about Julian Blaustein.
he was, to my mind, a fascinating producer. He made a wide variety of films. Probably the best known would be The Day the Earth Stood Still, which was remarkable, and, of course, had a political content that was slightly left-wing. In other words, I like peace. Peace is good. Well, in its era, that could have been considered commie. So Blasting was not, I don't believe he was blacklisted, but he was possibly under suspicion. He did some work independently.
Certainly sympathetic to blacklistees.
Yes, absolutely. He made Broken Arrow. He made 2 films that are Twilight Time releases. Desiree, which is about Napoleon and his lost love, with Marlon Brando and Gene Simmons. And the very delightful Bell, Book and Candle, which is a marvelous romantic comedy with a kind of magic, kind of fantasy element with James Stewart and Kim Novak. So he was one of these guys who, shall we say, roamed far and wide. He was a very interesting man. I'm trying to think if there are other people that we really ought to mention. I too want to mention Khalil, who is about to go, who plays, Khalil is Gordon's aide in this film. And eventually goes off with Stewart and also finds himself, sort of in the thick of history on various sides. He's played by an actor named Johnny Secca, who gives a kind of delightful performance in what might be a thankless role. He dignifies it, in my opinion. And Johnny Secca just ended up having a long, long career in all kinds of British television, some other films. I think he was in Woman of Straw.
Yeah, which is another Basil Dearden film. He was sort of the go-to black guy in English cinema of the 1960s. And he had promise. And I think people sort of thought for a while that he was a kind of an English Sidney Poitier, but he just never had, again, the kind of charisma of Sidney Poitier or the stature or the power of a Sidney Poitier. He's more whimsical. Whether that can be attributed to British racism and the lack of opportunities, he was kind of stereotyped as the black servant, here and in other films when he could have been more. He in other films he gives hints of much greater possibilities and intelligence than I think he was allowed to show, or that the British cinema, gave him the opportunity.
I want to ask you, Lem, if at some point you can tell that story. It was fascinating. We discussed on the phone the Stanley and Livingstone story and the connection.
Yes, no, continuing along the lines of the press involvement in so much of these myths and legends, essentially this film, it's not that interesting a story. It should be more like Patton. It should be more of a character portrait. They were barking up the wrong tree trying to make it into a big roadshow epic, and they concentrated on the wrong things. They think a roadshow epic is somehow historical battle scenes, and they're not quite focused on the right place, which is this divided character and showing his insanity and his larger-than-life qualities. It's a little too mundane and safe all the way through. The really extraordinary story is the story of another character named Amin Pasha and the Amin Pasha Relief Expedition. Amin Pasha was a very bizarre, strange, eccentric character. He was an Austrian doctor, another of those people who ran away from home, which is the story of so many of the people who end up in these exotic lands in that era. Usually they're fleeing something. His name was Arthur Schnitzler, I believe, and he was appointed by Gordon to be the governor of the province of Equatoria, which was a vast wasteland, even more so than Khartoum. Khartoum was like the urban center compared to the rest of the Sudan. So there was this vast region that was called Equatoria, which, as you can imagine, is really equatorial Africa. And he was cut off when the Mahdi started his campaign across this region of slaughter and rampage and occupation. This weird little guy, Emin Pasha, who was the governor appointed by Gordon of this province, which had, as Gordon's Khartoum does, mainly Egyptian soldiers who were not particularly loyal to him or to Gordon, and just local, Sudanese. And when it was found out that he was cut off, there was a huge outcry in England to rescue him. And it was promoted and encouraged by a kind of complicit press who saw a good story and saw a way to gin up a good story. And King Leopold of Belgium, who had interests in the Congo and was a notorious, cruel, the Belgian Congo is notorious and infamous for the level of cruelty to the local African population because of the rubber plantations and, the resources, stuff we're hearing about today from people who think we're there for the oil or whatever. Anyway, King Leopold of Belgium hired the famous American journalist H.M. Stanley, who had become famous for finding the lost Livingston, as in Stanley and Livingston, to go back to Africa and do the same thing again, find and relieve this little guy, Emin Pasha, in the middle of nowhere. And the whole point of it really was to land grab along the way. So ostensibly it was to perform a heroic act of rescue, but really it was to grab more territory for King Leopold. And Stanley, who was a huge, myth maker and myth maker as well, agreed to do this and took along with him a group of almost effete, aristocratic young British officers who paid for the privilege. They subscribed to the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition in order to be part of this great adventure and make their names and be part of something, like all the young British soldiers of that era. And it became a catastrophe, a disaster. It was, in fact, supposedly the influence on Joseph Conrad for Heart of Darkness. Because at one point, when they were all just starving, they got lost in the middle of the vast African jungle, because Stanley deliberately took a roundabout route, the most difficult possible route, because he also wanted to discover the source of the Nile and do all kinds of other things to promote himself. I mean, the last thing he really wanted to do was rescue Emin Pasha, which was just the ruse. So they got horribly lost in the jungle, and he set up a rear column. He left his rear column behind while he forged ahead. And the rear column succumbed to madness, like Heart of Darkness. And the leader of the rear column, a young officer named Bartolot, is apparently the model for Kurtz going mad in the jungle. So Stanley found Emin Pasha. He finally got through after most of his party had starved to death, and he was a shell of the Stanley who had embarked with such high hopes months and months and months before. And he found Emin Pasha, and it was like what you just said. Emin Pasha said, "What are you doing here? I don't want to be rescued. I want to hold my position." And in fact, it was Stanley, the rescuer, who was in need of rescue because he'd so run out of supplies and he was starving and all of his men were dead or had dysentery. But Stanley basically intimidated this little Emin Pasha guy into coming back with him so he would have his prize to return to the world with and show. Anyway, that's the story of the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition, which I don't understand has never been made into a movie, which is the movie that should have been made because it's incredible. It's the movie David Lean should have made at some point.
That's a great story.
It's a bizarre story, like so many stories from history.
This man here, one of those white turbaned guys, fans of Doctor Who, will recognize he was the original character, the Master, who was Doctor Who's arch nemesis, who has been played by numerous actors over the years. But he first played the Master in the, there he is leaning forward, Roger Delgado. Again, he's made up to look like a sinister Arab, and again, typecast as kind of, villainous characters. And he was the Master in the John Pertwee years of Doctor Who. And then he tragically was killed in a car accident, and John Pertwee has always said he retired as Doctor Who because he couldn't go back. He was such a great friend of Roger Delgado that he left the role of Doctor Who. And the other guy next to him is an actor named Marn Maitland, or Marnie Maitland, who again pops up in all the Hammer Mummy films, you know, in this same getup.
He's everywhere, yeah. This section is just feels like treading water to me, although I'm sure that there was some truth to it. But it's like, how many times can you hear, well, where's the army? Well, they're coming. Well, we're getting impatient. Well, you know, it gets kind of repetitive.
Boring is the word you're
Is
searching
it?
for. No, it's again, it's an interesting idea. How do you portray someone waiting? How do you portray the reality of a rather boring experience without being boring yourself?
Well,
if the reality was a 10-month siege, and the whole point is to show people getting weary and exhausted and tired, and you know, it's what The Wonderful Country does beautifully. Wonderful Country is about boredom in a way that I would say is lyrical and poetic and beautiful and lovely. It's a slow movie, but that's the point of it. I don't think the point of this is supposed to be as slow as it feels. Robert Mitchum in The Wonderful Country is wounded. He falls off his horse at the beginning, and so he's bedridden, or you know, he's immobile for much of the movie. And I think when you make that the point of it, it's okay. But they somehow don't quite do this in Khartoum as artistically as you might, but it's obviously very difficult to do that.
And then here's the moment that you were talking about, Lem, where he's forced to
Lawrence
execute someone he likes.
And this actor would live again as R.K. Maroon, the boss of Maroon Cartoon Studios and Who Framed Roger
Rabbit, yeah.
His name is Alan Tilvern.
He's got, you know, kind of a nasty-looking face. You know, I do think that this whole sequence is vitiated by the fact that we already know that Gordon was not averse to executing people. I don't believe this is only his second execution. We know he executed the son of the slave dealer.
And, of course, it's one of the best scenes in Major Dundee.
Yes.
Where Charlton Heston does the same thing to show that he's the commander.
Yeah, with a much more sympathetic character, too.
We also don't really have much sense of this being a siege.
No, and you know something, there's I believe like one scene where you see some people lying on the ground looking like they're a little bit faint. The truth is that at this point in the siege, people were beginning to starve. There was typhus in the town. You know, and instead what we see is a whole bunch of people, and we don't have an idea of how many in terms of the percentage of the town are going out to turn themselves over to the Mahdi.
No, it's undernourished. The whole film is very undernourished in all ways.
The siege ran from, I think, was it March 1884 to January 85, which is when it ended.
Yep.
With Gordon's death. But I think what is difficult to understand from the movie's point of view here is sort of where is the Mahdi? What is the Mahdi doing? What is he waiting for? Why is he? Where is he sitting?
Yes,
right
and in fact, there were, you know, during the 10 months of the siege, there were skirmishes all the time. They were always attempting to get in and never could, in part because Gordon was a really good military leader and had fortified the city quite well. So there was no getting in until two things happened. One was, I think probably the Mahdi thought, well, at the very least, I can starve these people out, which was beginning to happen by the end of the 10 months. The other thing is what we see here, which is that the Nile was beginning to fall, so the moat that was protecting Khartoum would be easily breached. But I think probably, you know, the Mahdi thought, well, I'll starve them out. I'll wait around. I'll try the odd skirmish. I'll try to get in through the walls, et cetera, et cetera. But then he heard, possibly, and I haven't read anything to confirm or deny this, it's possible that the Mahdi learned, even before Gordon learned, that the relief army was, in fact, close. like within a few days away. And much is made about the Mahdi lying to Gordon about that in the movie, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, and doing it strictly for, sadistic reasons, I might add. But
do you feel
when just the one thing is that when the Mahdi knew that the army was close, that's when he launched a really horrific attack and managed to get in through the walls, which he had not managed to do in 10 months. It was only like when there was a big stick hanging over him, going, "We're coming." That's when he managed to do what he had to do.
I was going to ask you if you feel that in reality the Mahdi seems reluctant to kill Gordon, and he seems to take it as a sort of a bad omen, that it will be somehow detrimental to him.
Here's my guess. I think that's completely false.
It's gibberish, yeah. Hollywood dramatization.
Well, it is, but you know what? You could say that it's the equivalent of the Zulus singing a song of praise to their worthy enemies at the end of Zulu, which also did not happen. They just melted away, oddly enough, when the relief army from Chelmsford was within sight. So,
And we're seeing Kitchener here leading this column.
Who's the actor who plays Kitchener?
Kitchener is being played by Peter Arne, who was in Straw Dogs, as Henry Niles, the brother of the David Warner character in Straw Dogs.
He looked familiar to me. I find him quite handsome.
He's an impressive actor who was in a lot of movies and television. He came to a very bad end. He was murdered.
Oh, no.
In a kind of case we've heard too many times of, he had a homeless young man in his flat who battered him to death. But he was a distinguished character actor in many, many films.
Yeah, I quite like him. He even makes Kitchener seems like the biggest man of action in the whole movie. No moral doubts, just doing his thing.
Yeah, and and Kitchener himself came to a bad end, but in the course of his profession as a professional soldier, his whole life, he died during World War I, where he was one of he was the most famous commander of the British forces in World War I, and he was on a ship that was sunk by a German U-boat. Oh. So he went down with the ship.
Yeah, here's the mining sequence that we mentioned before. Looks kind of sad. And now here we get a little. Wait for it. A little.
Yes, it's like fireworks. And
why are they hiding behind a breastwork?
Exactly. And even in the battle, when they utilize this supposed great strategic invention, it's like pop, pop. It's like little fireworks going off, and you think, big deal.
Can I just say we're being so hypercritical here, and particularly, in making our comparisons to Zulu and so forth. And I will say I am nevertheless quite fond of this movie.
Yes, no, I saw it when I was a boy. I saw it in Boston. I think I lived in England, but for one summer we went to America for a few weeks, and I saw it with my mother in a theater in Boston, Massachusetts. And of course, it was the equivalent of event films now to see a movie like this with that Cinerama logo.
Are there event films now?
Well, what they call event films now.
It doesn't feel like it. It doesn't feel like an event film in that, the curtain doesn't open and there's not the overture, and there are just so many aspects that are missing and that I frankly am hugely nostalgic for.
And every Charlton Heston film was an event film all the way through the 70s. When I was a teenager, you'd go see, even if it was just rubbish, like 2 Minute Warning or Earthquake or Airport 75. He was a larger than life. He himself was an event. In fact, one of his last films, True Lies, the James Cameron movie, he has a small role as the commander who sends Schwarzenegger off on his mission. And James Cameron said he needed an actor who could plausibly intimidate Arnold Schwarzenegger.
That'd be the one.
That would be the one, Charlton Heston. I went to a screening of El Cid at the Cinerama Dome.
Oh.
in Hollywood, whenever it would have been more than a decade ago, and he was there at a table afterwards in the lobby with a stack of photographs, and we all lined up to get our El Cid photograph signed by Charlton Heston. It's a thrilling moment when you meet someone like that, you know. Not that you meet him, but you see him just sitting there at a table.
It's like seeing a jungle cat out in the wild, you know.
Yeah. And Olivier, I've told this Olivier story before. I've made this joke before, but I was taken as a visitor to the set of Sleuth. So again, it was similar to this, where he's just doing a one-on-one on a sound stage with another actor. I was standing in the shadows, and an assistant director came up to me, and I was with the director, Michael Powell, who took me. And the assistant director told us to piss off because we were in Olivier's eye line. Which is the worst thing, you know, when an actor is looking ahead and he sees people standing in the shadows. It totally ruins the take.
Now you're going to have to confess, though, what you were doing with Michael Powell at the time.
Oh, no, I couldn't possibly. I was appearing as a child actor in a little film that Michael was making, which we won't mention because I wish it didn't exist. Wish my appearance in it didn't exist. But so I always make the joke that I've seen Olivier in performance, and Olivier in performance has seen me.
Pity.
Do you have a vivid memory of that set? That must have been quite impressive, that house.
I don't really. It just seemed like most sets, I suppose. Yeah, just like it seemed like a play. That's what it was. It was just like, you know, a section of a living room with a couch and chairs and whatever that it was, where Olivier and Kane were, you know, blocking out the scene, wandering around, talking to each other.
Going back to Zulu again, Julie, because you weren't with us that day, I've got to bring this up.
Uh-oh.
This is about Ulla Jacobsen at the very beginning.
Ulla.
The Otto Witt and his daughter Margareta, and her reaction to Lem and I were having a conversation in that commentary about whether or not it was prurient for small boys to go and see movies that had naked African women in them. And we talked about the fact that we were used to it from watching this on television. And you made a very interesting observation about her reaction to seeing those women and the ritual they were going through.
Well, I mean, in some sense, I think her reaction is the whole point, because she represents uptight Anglo-Western reactions to nudity, to sexuality, etc. She is clearly a very, should we say, tight little virgin. And, you know, she's looking at these beautiful young people, men and women, at the height of their sexual powers, one imagines. And, you know, they're next to naked. And the whole ritual is about sexuality, about the women losing their virginity. They hand over the tiny spears, which she asks about. She asks her father about it, and I'm thinking, I would never ask my father that question. It's you know, I think it's meant to, in a way to poke fun at the discomfort of Western audiences.
Yeah, I had said that it didn't seem prurient to us because it's in a non-sexual context, like a National Geographic documentary. But of course, it is a sexual context, as you say. It's a fertility dance, and it's all about that. But somehow, I don't know. It's as I said about this film, it would be if they made this film now, it would be so different just in terms of the casting. They'd cast actual Sudanese. You know, that was again something that Zulu got right because it was authentic. It was filmed in the real place with the real people, unlike this, which seems phony.
Well, this was not even shot in the Sudan. It was shot in Egypt, except for the parts that were shot in London at Pinewood.
Exactly. Like the director of this film, was he ever in Egypt? There are some shots of Charlton Heston that seem to be in the real locations.
I think so.
But it's such a jumble. You know, it's why Yakima Canutt is given that huge credit as second unit director. In fact, when David Lean made Lawrence of Arabia, there was a second unit director, which we should explain if you don't know. You know, on any film, usually, or certainly on any big film involving action, there's quite often a second unit which is a smaller unit, which goes and just gets shots that are kind of mundane and boring of horses and, encampments and cannons being gotten into position and stunts and things like that the main director wouldn't necessarily waste his time with because of the need to have a shooting schedule that's manageable and that's efficient. So the director usually works with the principal cast, the actors, and allows the second unit to get a lot of shots that are necessary to fill in the detail of a big elaborate action sequence. And David Lean, when he made Lawrence, there was a great director in his own right, a very good director, Andre de Toth, was a second unit director on Lawrence, and I think he was there at the behest of the producer, because he always tells the story that Lean came up to him and said, I hate you, in a kind of affectionate way, meaning I hate any shot in the movie that I don't personally direct. This film is going to say directed by David Lean, and I believe that every single shot in that film should be directed by David Lean. A film like this, a huge percentage of it is not directed by Basil Dearden, from that opening mini documentary to most of the action stuff, which is in the hands of this the most legendary stuntman that ever lived, Yakima Canutt, who really invented everything that's known in the film industry pretty much about stunt work. Some of it now quite controversial. The technique known as horse falls, which some of the shots of horse falls are in fact censored out of versions of this film. I think in England particularly, it's you're not allowed to even have those shots in a movie, and they censor films.
Although Yakima Canutt very proudly said that not a single horse was injured on this production, except that at one point, and this had nothing to do with filming, a couple of rowdies from the town swiped two of the horses and went joyriding and hurt the horses. But other than that, he maintained that there, was nothing. But it may well have been that he was forced into saying that because
possibly
people were attacking those falls, which now I believe are illegal.
They are illegal now. The thing called, I think it's the running W, which is the one where they
use
foreleg
a
of the horse and they pull it. A wrangler pulls the rope tight. You see it very clearly in the opening sequence of The Wild Bunch when they're trying to get out of the town.
Yes.
You see the wranglers pulling the wires that trip the horses up, and that's a leg breaker,
Yeah. Well, and Yakima Canutt, of course, he started as a rodeo cowboy. He was an expert horseman and stunt rider and bull rider and all the rest of it, and drifted into Hollywood in the early years. And his most famous stunt of all, which really made his name, was in Stagecoach, where he, doubling for John Wayne, and the stagecoach becomes a runaway and is out of control, and he leaps from one set of horses to the next and goes underneath the stagecoach and gets dragged along the dirt. And Spielberg paid homage to that in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the great modern stuntman Terry Leonard does the same thing in that Nazi truck and goes underneath it. And
and is it Yakima Canutt or his son who
Ben-Hur.
Ben-Hur, you see that one shot where it looks like he somersaults right over the...
incredible stuff that would be done with CGI special effects now, and it was all real.
That was his son. But the sequence, obviously, he worked very closely, shall we say, with William Wyler on that. Yakima Canutt did.
And on many, he had worked on El Cid with Heston as well, and he went all the way to Where Eagles Dare. I mean, from the dawn of Hollywood to Where Eagles Dare, and he lived to be 90. And you think, and when you read about the injuries over the years, you think, my God.
He thrived on it.
Like a horse fell on him and crushed his internal organs, and yet a guy like that lived to be 90, and strong as an ox.
It strikes me that guys like that would have made very good generals of this period because they could figure out strategies for getting anything done. They were physically unbelievably hardy.
Yeah. And I think he was the commanding general of the logistics of this film and the action sequences, because that's something Basil Dearden was never, proficient at or never had the experience of doing in any prior film.
The scene that we're watching at the moment, I think is one of the best scenes in the film, maybe the best scene in the film, not just because of its sort of shock value that's going to come at the end of the scene, but this is really where each one of them is going to die of each other's,
miracle.
Miracle, exactly.
No, this is the reason it got nominated for an Oscar, this screenplay. I think This is the real climax of the film. There's the battle climax to come, but this is the emotional character climax. And they're both marvelous.
They are both marvelous.
Already. Is it possible you still do not?
Oh, we got caught up watching the movie.
I know,
Oops.
One time.
It doesn't. Yes, it doesn't happen much with us, but that's a powerful moment. Just watching the two faces. Again, something that Lem and I bang on about, over and over again, is how watchable movies were and how unwatchable they are now. Because I think Lem coined the phrase that they're not movies at all now. They're not movies as we knew movies to be. This is good, bad, or indifferent. Khartoum is a movie.
Yeah, and I said it's boring, but I saw it when I was 8 years old, and I don't remember squirming in my seat.
No,
or
you were
saying,
riveted.
I was riveted. It was a big, exciting event movie to go see and enjoy and sit through. It's a rather long movie for an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, whatever I was. And yet I don't remember complaining or saying, can we leave now? Or when's there going to be a battle? I don't,
Part of it is that you're so, when you go and see a roadshow movie like this and it's in Cinerama and so forth, you're enveloped in it. It's a total experience. Mm-hmm. It's a physical experience. You may just be sitting, but there is a physical, all senses involved experience.
It's exciting.
Which is wonderful. And I think, people bitch and complain about how people, text and stuff like that in movie theaters. Maybe if the movies were a little more interesting, they'd put down their phones.
Of course. And this was, and again, particularly for an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, this was a harrowing, horrifying moment that was memorable that you
the
thought
head's
about.
in the hand.
And the hand, particularly with the ring.
Ring on it.
Chilling. Well, here's a trivia question for you now.
Uh-oh.
What is the name of the horse's head in The Godfather?
Khartoum.
Excellent.
Damn.
Very good. Oh, my God.
Ooh.
So what's the connection there, do you think?
I wonder. You know why I remember it? It's because of the way he says it. Khartoum, when he's like stroking it. John Marlowe.
God, I don't even remember it being spoken in the film.
It is. Otherwise, I wouldn't have remembered. He sort of murmurs the name like a little melody.
There's something so exotic. We were joking about this the other day that, you'd go and see a movie because it was called Khartoum or Mozambique, anything that sounded like, you were going to be...
Zulu!
Anything that sounded like you were going to be in some fantastically different place, seeing things that, that you would like to do when you grew
again,
up.
we've talked about this 1,000 times, but again, we're always saying, why can't we have... Why does it seem so essential to younger audiences in particular, it seems, to have, and I'm going to sound like the most disgusting old fart, but I'm just going to say it anyway. Why does it seem so essential to have movies that take place, in high school or on your street or whatever? Where's your imagination? Don't you want to get out into a larger world where you've never been, where things are exotic? Has the appeal of the exotic gone away?
Well, it's this idiotic feeling that the audience wants to see, that kids want to see movies about kids, where I never wanted
didn't.
No, when I was a kid, you'd go to the Disney films like all kids did, but you projected yourself into adult characters, and you had a window onto an adult world
I wanted
as
to
a
be
kid that you
grown-up.
wanted to see and learn about.
Yeah.
And you'd go back on your bike and pretend to be Steve McQueen, not some 8-year-old.
Yes. Remember at Saturday Morning Pictures, Lem, as we used to call it, there would be those CFF movies, the Children's Film Foundation.
Yes, the
Do you
one we're
remember?
not supposed to mention. Shh.
Yeah, we're not going to mention it. Don't worry. But you know what I mean. Those were the movies where you were watching films about our peers. But that was something you did on Saturday mornings only. You didn't actually pay to go and see those movies.
And here are some horse falls. So we're watching the uncut version of Khartoum.
And I think we are going to see the running W's there. You see where the front legs, the forelegs, go completely out from under them.
And this film has so little detail compared to the other films we've been mentioning that if you cut out any of these little moments of shots, it must seem even more impoverished. But it's telling, unfortunately, that it's called Khartoum. It should be called Gordon of Khartoum,
yeah.
you know,
Or the Siege of Khartoum.
or it should be, yes, if it's called Khartoum, it should be, and I think it may have been called The Siege of Khartoum. The original screenplay may have been titled that.
But I like your idea of like making it just about the siege.
Yeah, it falls between the two stools. It's not Patton or Lawrence or Major Dundee. It should be either more of a character study or more of a strategic look, like Zulu was, of a particular action.
Or Gordon and the Mahdi.
Or Gordon and the Mahdi, exactly, the play. And here you see the classic Yakima Canutt kind of standard stunt work. It's amazing in all these movies when someone gets shot, they launch themselves into the air. They leap over parapets and things when they get shot.
Yes. I do love all the shots of the sails on the Nile. I find the boats on the Nile so beautiful.
But again, disconnected from our main guy.
I know,
It's
and
like
you
they're
don't
just-
have you don't have a sense of the logic of the battle. Whereas, like for example, in Zulu, the logic where they fall back to the redoubt, and then where the lines of men fire and then drop, and the ones behind them fire. Although I love that shot, that traveling
that's
shot.
nice. That's a kind of cinerama. They did this kind of
That's great.
you are there kind of 3D effects. But again, where's your hero? Where's Heston? What's he doing? Why aren't
He's
intercutting with him somehow?
He's hanging around, waiting for his death scene.
It's like this is all second unit stuff that's divorced from our guy.
And one of the strategies that the real Gordon had done is he had made the city, he had halved the size of the city, remember? He had built redoubts within the city.
He had many, many strategies, which unfortunately we don't get to see too much of. See, I love that too. Plunging through the narrow streets.
It was the cinerama trick, like, scenes in Battle of the Bulge and Custer of the West that are just completely isolated, like rides, like Disneyland rides, where you're going down the roaring rapids, or those kind of scenes in The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm, where you're on a runaway, wagon going on a very narrow.
Yes, and it's all going like that. Okay, so now they're coming into the palace, and I will say that when they have the scene where he's coming down the stairs and everybody's poised to kill him, to throw the spears and so forth, that is actually based on a very famous painting. And of course, I can't tell you the name of the artist.
Yeah,
Maybe you can.
Can't remember.
But it is a remarkable and quite accurate, almost vignette-like recreation of this painting.
Yeah. And
Which,
again,
of
which
course,
apparently is a myth. It's a complete myth. And
Yeah.
It was never like
right
this.
here. This is the painting.
That's the painting.
And that, that's a genre of painting. John Ford copied that
sure.
kind of genre painting all the time to great effect.
And Heston loved a heroic death.
He did.
He died at the end of El Cid and at the end of the Omega Man and,
Yes.
So many films. And even in ones where he didn't, like Major Dundee, he loved getting an arrow in the thigh.
Yes.
It's kind of like Mel Gibson.
Yes, he had a kind of masochistic streak. And of course, in the Omega Man, he does get a spear like that in the
And
chest.
look at the ironic smile. Thank you for delivering me to the death I desired.
I always wondered as a kid, when someone throws a spear, why doesn't it just bounce? Wouldn't it just bounce off your clothing? Imagine the force with which you have
Yes.
to actually throw it to make it penetrate through clothing and the skin and the
I've
flesh.
always been baffled. It never seems to go deep enough. It's got to get your heart.
The one person we haven't mentioned is the cinematographer, Ted Scaife. Now, again, I should mention that there were supposedly, maybe in the original Roadshow release, I don't know, shots of Heston's head on the end of the stick.
I find that dubious.
And they don't show it.
They
So
don't,
you're
and
supposed to
I
guess
think
what it is.
there's a shot of it that ends the scene. And by the way, this is actually true to life. The Mahdi was very upset that he was brought the head because he wanted Gordon alive. I don't know if he wanted to keep him alive.
See, are we going to see it now?
But it goes into
It
darkness.
goes into darkness now, so maybe it was. But the cinematographer Ted Scaife, Edward Scaife, was kind of an African specialist. He'd photographed The Lion, Carol Reed's film The Lion, and Storm Over the Nile. and 3 Tarzan films. I think he photographed the first Tarzan film to actually be filmed in Africa, as well as other ones in other exotic countries. And immediately after Khartoum, his next 3 credits were The Dirty Dozen, Dark of the Sun, and Play Dirty, 2 of which are magnificent Africa set films that, of course, we highly recommend, Dark of the Sun and Play Dirty. So he was a guy's cinematographer, not a girl's cinematographer.
And that would mean quoi?
Well, on that note, I think we should bid each other farewell, Julie and Lem. Thank you so much for joining us on this.
Hail and farewell.
Thank you.
Thank you.